Chapter 16 of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, in which it is to be hoped everything is settled to the reader's satisfaction. The day following the Neptune House fire, Mr. Jebb and his friend Robinson called again at the Argus office. This time they found Frank in, and they hastened to express their gratitude for the service he had rendered them on the previous morning. "Don't mention it," replied the boy. "I didn't do any more for you than I should have done for anyone placed in a similarly unfortunate position. After this, I trust there may be no hard feelings between us on account of old scores," said Mr. Jebb, rising to go. "It is not my nature to hold a grudge against any man," said Frank generously. "But of course you can hardly expect me to forget how you treated the confidence both my father and my mother reposed in you when you were entrusted with the control of the Argus." "I admit the delinquency of my conduct and ask your forgiveness," said the Chicago journalist. "What I did, I blush to admit I did for money. I see the error of my ways, which I believe has acted as a sort of boomerang. I have strong suspicions that the party who incited me to it is responsible for the Neptune House fire and all connected therewith." "You can't mean Squire—" began Frank, horrified at the idea which chimed in with Dan Harwood's belief, privately expressed to him. "No matter who I mean," said Mr. Jebb grimly. "If I can bring the truth home to him, a very respectable member of the community will do time at the public's expense. I believe we're agreed on that, are we not, Robinson?" "Well, I should warble," replied the irrepressible reporter. "It is quite possible you may see us again before we leave this burg for our old stamping grounds," continued Mr. Jebb, "in which event we may furnish you with a story for your column which will startle Green River." With these words, Mr. Jebb and his friend Robinson took their departure. It was about this time that Duncan Roach left Green River to attend the University of Michigan. We are sorry to have to say that he went away without having thanked Frank Morris for his noble action in saving his life the night the Benson house was destroyed. Frank finished the bolt and lock catalog on time, and the job was pronounced by the manager of the manufactory to be fully up to the Chicago standard. He was a proud boy when he received the company's check for the work and passed it over to his mother for endorsement so he could deposit it to her account in the Green River Bank. He made a profit of $410 on the job, and the business of the job printing plant added to the Argus was increasing steadily week by week, in spite of the lower competitive prices advertised by Bentley of the Times. This was due not only to the high class of work Frank turned out, made possible by skilled workmen and by the introduction of the most popular faces of job letter in the general use in the West, but by his genial manners as a canvasser for the trade of his townspeople, who one and all admired the boy's grit and perseverance and felt disposed to encourage him with their patronage. Had the Times man used ordinary business judgment, he could have saved a large part of the trade which drifted to the Argus office. Most people don't care to change, all things being equal. But Bentley's methods, never the best at any stage of his career, grew steadily more slipshod under Billings, who was an indifferent workman, and his lack of mechanical knowledge was reflected in the work he turned out for his boss. Billings, however, possessed a great gift of gab, and he made Bentley believe he was the whole thing. Walt Edwards had become a good friend of Frank Morris, and his example was followed by Eddie Hicks, Peter Winch, Spencer Lickett, and others of their set, so that the young editor was gradually getting introduced into the best society of Green River. Judge Smith had practically taken him up, to use the expression, and this added greatly to the young fellow's importance in the community. Whatever influence the Argus had lost under Mr. Jebb, it had fully recovered by Frank's clear and undevising course of action from the day he first shaped its policy in conformity with his father's views. The Argus now had the entire confidence of the Republican County Committee, and Frank's trenchant pen was expected to do much towards leading the party to victory at the forthcoming local elections in November. 3/4 of the people of the community were now taking the Argus, probably half of the number being directly interested in the outcome of the young editor's serial story without a title, the plot of which and the incidents thereof he was handling with such skill as to attract the notice of many out-of-town newspaper editors, thereby bringing him favorable criticisms, which he printed in the Argus. He had long since exhausted his supply of specimen copies, and was compelled to reset the first chapters of the story and print off several thousand copies of the same to fill the demands made upon him by the later subscribers, who continued to come in at the average of 100 a day. The success of the scheme was largely beyond his most sanguine expectations, so much so, indeed, that he was induced to make the announcement of 2 additional prizes of $50 and $25 for the second and third best titles, a booby prize of $10 for the worst title, as well as 10 consolation prizes of $5 each, to be awarded to 10 titles to be selected blindfolded from the entire bunch of names sent in after the regular prize winners had been selected. Harwood had improved upon his popular local paragraphs by originating a half-column of bright and witty creations under the heading of Dan Harwood's Own, which appeared regularly and were copied by many of the big dailies throughout the country. About 3 o'clock one afternoon, exactly a week from the date of the Neptune House fire, while Frank was writing an editorial for the ensuing day's paper, Dan Harwood, who had been collecting local items to be written up later in his own versatile style, rushed into the editorial sanctum and blurted out, "You'll never guess what news I brought." "What is it?" asked the young editor, sitting back in his chair and regarding his assistant with much interest, for he appeared to be greatly excited. "Squire Roach is dead." "No!" exclaimed Morris, swinging around and facing Dan, for his news was a startler. "Dropped dead in the bank an hour ago in the midst of an interview with Mr. Jebb and his friend Robinson." "Well, this is a sudden. What's the cause? Apoplexy?" "Heart failure, the physician called it, induced by some intense emotion or excitement. The cashier, Mr. Winch, said that the interview between the squire and his visitors was particularly stormy. I don't think it would be hard for you and I to surmise what took place at that interview." Frank always found it necessary to work late on the evening before publication day. That night, when he returned to the office after supper, he found a package on his desk which Wiggles, the boy, said had been left by a messenger from the Neptune House. Frank opened the package and found a bunch of copy in Mr. Jebb's handwriting. The boy read it over carefully down to the end of the last page, to which was attached an affidavit, signed and sworn by Amos Jebb and Ajax Robinson, attesting to the truth of the foregoing. A brief note accompanied the manuscript, which read as follows: "Here's where you get back at the man who hired me to do the Argus. Today we accidentally found the enclosed watch seal, bearing the squire's initials, and which any acquaintance of that gentleman's will immediately recognize under the window of the burned room where the attempt was made on my life and Mr. Robinson's. With this in our possession, we interviewed Squire Roach, with results not according to our expectations. We brought the crime home to him, and he collapsed. You are authorized to make whatever use of our sworn statement you see fit. You now hold the dead man's reputation in your hands. Goodbye, Frank Morris. Robinson and myself are off for Chicago. Amos Jebb." Just then Dan came in, and Frank handed him Mr. Jebb's manuscript without a word. Harwood read it over from beginning to end, also the letter. "Well," he said, "what are you going to do with it? You won't publish it, surely?" "Publish that?" said the boy, looking Dan Squire in the eye. "I'm not built that way. The squire is dead. Let him rest in peace. No act of mine shall bring disgrace to his memory. Put the whole thing, affidavit and all, in the composing-room stove." 2 months later, the final installment of Frank Morris's novelette without a title appeared in the Argus with a successful name attached. The first prize was won by a young woman in St. Louis, the second by another woman in Oakland, California, and the third by a New Yorker. The booby prize was drawn by Peter Winch of Green River, to the great amusement of that young gentleman's friends. Frank, in figuring up the financial results, found that he received about $5,000 in trial subscriptions, and as much more from increased advertising patronage directly and indirectly traceable to his inflated circulation. The scheme also proved of permanent value to him, for he was able to hold the several thousand Green River subscribers after the story was finished, and most of them thereafter renewed their patronage from year to year. The local elections, which took place early in November, boosted the Republicans of Green River into power again, and after the first of the ensuing year the young editor received his reward for his unswerving support of the party, when the Argus was made the official organ of the county in place of the Times. On Christmas morning Frank was treated to a surprise. He found a bill of sale of the Argus establishment, made out to himself, and signed by his mother in his stocking, which she had persuaded him to hang to the mantel as in days of old. He found something else, too, in his stocking, which almost pleased him as much. Whatever it was, it bore the compliments of the season from Elsie Gray. Frank figured up the profits of his job-printing branch on the first of the year, and found it had cleared a profit of about $1,500 since he took hold of it. With increased facilities, new type and machinery, the boy was expected to clear $5,000 during the coming year, without considering the profits of the Argus, which would undoubtedly be large, as he had many other schemes to boom it to a higher plane. Frank paid off the mortgage on the cottage when it became due, so that now his mother owned it free and clear. Duncan Roach came home from college to spend the Christmas holidays, but his disposition was the same as ever, and he found, greatly to his disgust, that Frank Morris had supplanted him in the good graces of his own particular set, of which Walt Edwards and Eddie Hicks were the leaders. It is noticed that Frank finds occasion to visit the Gray farm very often, from which fact the wise ones argue that it won't be so very long before Elsie Gray will take up her permanent abode at the Morris cottage as Frank's wife. The end. End of chapter 16. End of Winning His Way by a Self-Made Man. Recording by Keith Salis.